Hello. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Welcome to Virtual Lunch with the League about the very timely subject of redistricting. I'm Helen Hudson, President of the League of Women Voters of Montgomery County, sponsor of Lunch with the League, and of so many other services we citizens count on, especially during a census and an election year. If you believe our citizenry benefits from this nonpartisan educational part of our democratic process, please join us. Visit our webpage and our Facebook page to learn more. Our membership year goes from July 1st to June 30th, so no better time than right now to renew your membership or join our local League of Women Voters. As many of you watching know, but which always bears repeating, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to informing citizens about vital issues of public concern and encouraging us all to be registered and active voters, as well as active participants in local government. That said, let us begin. It is my pleasure to introduce to you this morning our Lunch with the League coordinator and valiant producer and production manager, Marco Dees. Thank you, Marco. Good morning. Thank you, Marco, for these pioneering efforts which allow us to continue learning and sharing with the public all this information during the pandemic. We have three guests with us this morning. First, I am so honored to introduce this month's speaker, Julia Vaughn. Julia is one of Indiana's most important leaders for citizens' active participation in public life. For 25 years now, Julia has been associated with Common Cause Indiana, a highly respected organization whose name itself suggests its purpose. Common Cause Indiana works to help citizens make our voices heard on behalf of open, honest, and accountable government. Common Cause has recently been convening citizen advocacy trainings across the state to help Hoosiers become more effective advocates for democracy reform. As policy director, Julia Vaughn is responsible for policy development, lobbying, grassroots organizing, and coalition building here in the Hoosier State. Earlier in her career, she was director of health policy for the Citizens Action Coalition. She has also served as director of Count Us In, a project to help increase political participation by Hoosiers with disabilities. So Julia has been using her degree in telecommunications from Indiana University for a couple of decades now to improve all of our lives. It is a great pleasure to have her join us here today. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
Also with us to ask questions afterward are two powerful leaders and workers in our community, workers for fair and honest government. Both are League members. I'm pleased to introduce Jennifer Lowe, City Councilwoman, and David Hadley, retired Wabash College professor of political science who specializes in political parties. We thank you both so very much. Julia, I'd like to turn the program over to you at this point. And again, our thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Helen. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for that kind introduction. Thank you, Marco, for your technical expertise. It's really my pleasure to be with you this morning. We are going to focus on what's new with redistricting reform, but I do want to step back just a couple of slides and make sure you're familiar with my organization and the coalition that we do our redistricting work under. Common Cause, we've been around since 1970, so we are celebrating 50 years of advocacy this year. We were founded by a guy named John Gardner, one of the, I think, most important Americans that many people aren't familiar with. He had a long career in the public and private sector, served as Secretary of Health and Education and Welfare during the Johnson administration, left the Johnson administration because of his opposition to the Vietnam War. And in 1970, founded this group, Common Cause, which was focused on open, honest, and accountable government. So since that time, we work on issues like campaign finance reform, open government, elections, and voting, which is an extremely important issue we've spent our spring and summer focused on, and then finally redistricting reform. So if you have not signed up for our action alerts, I would encourage you to go to our website, commoncause.org. It will say sign up for CauseNets. That's what we call our action alerts. So get lots of information about both state and national issues that way. And then you can connect with the state organization on both Facebook and Twitter at Common Cause Indiana. So that's primarily the way we get the word out to folks here in Hoosier Land. The Indiana Coalition for Independent Redistricting, which operates under the tagline All In for Democracy, is a joint effort started by the League of Women Voters of Indiana and Common Cause Indiana back in 2014. You know, we have been working together for decades in this state on election and voting policy. And we were toiling in the vineyards on redistricting reform in the early part of this decade. And we finally decided, you know, this is lonely work, just the two of us. We've really got to expand our ranks if we're going to make any progress on redistricting reform. So we set out to build a coalition, and we've been pretty successful. We've built a 25 organization coalition. We include a lot of progressive organizations. Unfortunately, we haven't been very successful at reaching out to conservative groups to join us, but I think that's one of the natures of this issue. There are certain losers and certain winners in gerrymandering, and one side of the political equation seems to think that gerrymandering's worked pretty well for them. So unfortunately, we do all tend to be of the progressive side of the political equation, but they're issue-oriented organizations. You know, unfortunately, here in Indiana, we don't have a lot of advocates that focus full-time on democracy, like the League and Common Cause. But, you know, it was very interesting back in 2014, we started reaching out to environmental groups and groups that represent women and groups that represent minority voters and, you know, just very different kinds of organizations all seem to have that light bulb moment back in mid-decade where they started understanding that the fate of their issues were absolutely tied to redistricting reform, that if we continue to have gerrymandering in Indiana that allows one party to control state government, that they probably weren't going to make progress on whatever issue it is they care about, the environment, health insurance, again, women's issues. And so it was frankly quite easy to draw people to a coalition organized around redistricting reform because people now understand how gerrymandering is impacting issues in Indiana. Most recently, we've spent a lot of time reaching out to the education community. You know, teachers, administrators, local school districts, they've gone through a lot of change over the past decade, and much of it isn't working well at the local level. And, you know, it's why you saw thousands and thousands of teachers turn out on Organization Day at the State House last year. And so our message about redistricting reform in particular is resonating in the education community. I think a lot of people understand that until we get this right, and if we don't get the districts right next year, then it's going to be another decade of really, you know, turmoil in the education community. So again, we've kind of gone where the action is. and spent a lot of time explaining to people who are engaged at the grassroots level around issues how their issue is connected to redistricting reform. And as I said, it's not been a tough sell. People really have begun to understand that here in Indiana. So that's a little bit about Common Cause and the Redistricting Coalition. I want to just step back a little bit because I know there will be a lot of different people watching this over the internet. So let's talk just very basically about why do we redistrict? You know, why do every decade we go through this process, which too often results in unfair representation or gerrymandering? Well, you know, there's a very good and straightforward reason why we do it. We're having a census this year, right? And we're trying to figure out exactly how many people in the United States, how many people in each state. So that's the very straightforward reason why we do it. We'll have new census numbers later on this year or early next year, actually. And it be to honor the principle of one person, one vote, which is enshrined in our Constitution. We have to rebalance the population in each district, each political district in our country, whether it's a congressional district or a state legislative district. They're all supposed to be relatively even in population. And of course, as people die and are born throughout the decade, they become uneven. So that's the whole reason why we need to redistrict. It becomes problematic because in Indiana, as in most states, we give that job to absolutely the wrong group of people. We give it to the group who is most self-interested in what the districts turn out to be politically. So we give the job to the people for whom it's the biggest conflict of interest, the state legislature. And in Indiana, as in most states, our state legislature is in charge of not only drawing their own districts for state senate, state house, but then they also draw them for their congressional districts here in Indiana. So, you know, one of the best ways to describe what happens here is we have a process that allows politicians to choose their voters rather than allowing voters to choose their politicians come election day. So it's been problematic here in Indiana. In 2011, the situation was a little different than it had been in 2001 and 1991. And the difference was that Republicans controlled both chambers of the General Assembly. They controlled both the House of Representatives and the Indiana Senate. So that meant they controlled the table. They had absolute control of this process. Very different from the scenario in 91 and 2001 when Democrats controlled the Indiana House of Representatives. Now, please understand me. Democrats, Republicans, it doesn't matter. They both gerrymander. It's the party in minority that tends to support redistricting reform. And ironically, back in the 90s and 2000s, it was the House Republicans that were all gung-ho on redistricting reform. Of course, that flipped. When they suddenly gained control, it was like, well, we don't know about this redistricting reform stuff. So both parties in Indiana, when they had the opportunity to skew the maps to advantage themselves, they've done that. Now, the one good thing about the scenario we had in 91 and 2001, you know, they would have these sweetheart deals where Democrats would skew the House maps to benefit themselves. In the Senate, the Republicans would gerrymander those maps. But when it came to Congress, right, both sides had an interest in making those maps as fair to both sides as possible. So to me, that's one of the most damning pieces of evidence that, you know, when you have one side controlling the table, that's when things really get out of control in terms of gerrymandering. We actually had competition in our congressional districts in the previous decade again, because both Democrats and Republicans had a hand in shaping those districts. In 2011, though, with Democrats in the back seat having not enough votes to impact the process because Republicans held a supermajority, we've had no competition at the congressional level. And in fact, over the past decade, we have seen almost no close races at the congressional level. And so I think that leads, and let me mention that, you know, what happened in 2011 in Indiana was not unique. We've seen it happen in state after state, and it was part of a concentrated and very successful strategy that the Republican National Party ran in 2010. You may recall a guy named Tom DeLay, congressman from Texas. He ran what was called the Red Map strategy. And that was pump as much money as they can into state house and governor's races in 2010 to make sure that the Republican Party controlled as many state legislatures as possible, because they draw the congressional maps and that helped build the congressional majority in Washington, D.C. So, you know, again, this is something that was not unique to Indiana. We saw a lot of state houses across the country turn red in 2010, and that absolutely had a national impact on the makeup of not just state legislatures, but congressional delegations all across the country. So since 2011, we have been operating here in Indiana under these maps. And what are some of the problems that we've seen? Well, I think one of the most obvious ones is that we have a lot of safe districts, districts that have drawn to be non-competitive, to reliably elect either a Republican or a Democrat. So we've got very little competition both at the congressional level and at the state legislative level. And that fuels apathy and lack of voter turnout at the local level. You know, in 2014, Indiana had the dubious distinction of having the lowest voter turnout in the country. We ranked dead last.
Wow.
Big reason for that is, for example, in 44 of the 100 races for the Indiana House of Representatives, there was only one major party candidate on the ballot in November. So in almost half of our state house races, people literally, if you didn't support the incumbent, you didn't have much reason to show up. So we have a lot of districts in our state where the outcome is so predetermined that voters don't have much motivation. They literally don't have anybody to vote for. That's totally true. I live in the inner city of Indianapolis in an 80% Democrat district. So it is highly unlikely that the incumbent will have a challenger in November. It's somebody who will have to be appointed by the party if they can find somebody who, you know, wants to run a futile campaign. We have many communities of interest across the state that they are divided up in a way that their needs are ignored or underserved. There are a lot of good examples of that. Here in Indianapolis, my favorite example is Senate District 26, which connects the small town of Greenfield, Indiana. The district kind of starts in Greenfield and then runs west into Marion County, into the inner city of Indianapolis. And, you know, those are just two very different communities of interest. 42nd and Post, you know, a very low income area, large numbers of minorities, is just an extremely different district than Greenfield, Indiana, you know, which is still very Mayberry-esque, very small town. And so Senator Mike Crider, who represents that district, admits, you know, he lives in Greenfield, and it's extremely difficult for him to represent this district in a way that is fully representative of everyone in his district. And interestingly, the bulk of the population is in Marion County. But this guy lives in Greenfield, and, of course, turnout's low in Marion County. So the votes that he gets in Greenfield, are the ones that get him elected. So communities of interest throughout the state, there are lots of odd combinations. Another favorite of mine is House District 60, which connects parts of Bloomington with Martinsville. Bloomington and Martinsville, sister cities, I'm sure, but, a lot of people don't think so, and they think that's an odd combination. And interestingly, that district, before the districts were drawn in 2011, was represented by a Democrat, and radically changed in the redistricting from 2011, and since that time, it has been represented by a Republican. So a good example of a district that was drawn to be flipped, and it did flip, and it has stayed flipped the entire decade. I think when you have safe seats, like I mentioned, those 80% seats that we have, both Republican and Democrat, that can lead to unresponsive legislators. If you are guaranteed re-election, if really the only person you have to listen to is the party chairman, keep him or her happy and you're good, and you don't worry about your voters, that's, a good way to have a legislator or elected official who simply isn't responsive to the needs of the voter, and certainly that's not good for voters. It has absolutely led to the polarization in politics, and I think that's frustrating for a lot of Hoosiers because, the people I meet and talk to who are members of my organization, they tend to be moderates. They're right there in the middle. They see things from both sides, and increasingly that's not who we elect, because in most parts of our state, the only competition is in the primary. Republicans are electing people who are really to the far, far right. I don't know in what parts of Indiana we're electing far left Democrats, but we've certainly seen it. The Republican Party really, really creep hard to the right. So that polarization is very difficult. And simply the will of our voters is being skewed here in Indiana because of these lopsided districts. So I think we can see lots and lots of problems that have been hatched since the last round of redistricting. So how do we get to the end of this problem? We're going to have redistricting reform, and we need to change both the who and the how. But the who draws the map is easily the biggest question that we need to answer. We should have a Citizens Redistricting Commission. California has the best model. We put together legislation that would have not exactly copied the California model. It was sort of an interesting mixture of a bunch of different approaches, but unfortunately we weren't successful. Just a little bit of history as to our reform efforts here in Indiana. You may recall, I know you folks over in Crawfordsville, Montgomery County have been really active. I wanted to recognize that both the Crawfordsville City Council passed a resolution in support of redistricting reform, as did the Montgomery County Council. And I need to tell you how important that was. You may think, oh, that's just a symbolic gesture, but I can tell you that you were part of 33 local communities who took this initiative. And when I would talk to legislators about it, that sometimes the response would be, oh, sure, Indianapolis, Bloomington, West Lafayette, those liberal towns. And I'd say, oh, really? Well, what about Crawfordsville? What about Montgomery County? What about those towns? And they would, they would then start to listen, because it was obvious that this isn't just something that, only liberals or only Democrats are talking about. So you guys were really a great help, and those were important organizing efforts. And that was one of the ways that we were able to get a bipartisan recommendation for redistricting reform via a citizens commission out of the Special Interim Committee on Redistricting Reform. It seems like a million years ago now, but remember that was back around 2015, 2016. So we did that. We worked really hard. That became House Bill 1014 in 2017. We worked really hard to get that bill a hearing. We had to get the speaker involved, and frankly, the chair of the committee at that time, who is no longer in the legislature, he wouldn't have given us a hearing if the speaker hadn't leaned on him a little bit. We had just 24 hours notice before that hearing. We still managed to pack the House chamber with 300 people. And our reward for that, and I should mention there was just about an hour and a half of testimony, all of it in favor, except for one lone guy who stood up and testified against the bill. And then the chairman didn't call it for a vote. So that's what happened to us back in 2017. In 2018, we decided that the chair of the House Elections Committee, he wasn't willing to play fair, so that we needed to start our effort in the Senate. We have had a pretty good relationship with Senator Greg Walker, the chair of the Senate Elections Committee. Unfortunately, we had some pretty fundamental differences with him. So instead of focusing on a citizens commission, or the who part of the reform equation, Senator Walker chose to focus on the how. How should districts be drawn? So he sponsored a bill both in 2018 and 2019 that would have put in statute a set of criteria that legislators would have to draw before they draw, or as they draw new districts. That bill passed the Senate by a pretty overwhelming margin in 2018, only to not get a hearing in the House. Then in 2019, it barely passed the Senate, and once again did not get a hearing in the House, so died. We also have worked very closely with Senator John Ruckelshaus, who is a Republican from Indianapolis. We co-wrote with that senator a bill that created a redistricting commission and put criteria in place. Unfortunately, Senator Walker would not give that bill a hearing. So that's what happened in the legislature over these past several years with our efforts on redistricting reform. What doomed those efforts? I think the biggest problem was we didn't get a decision from the United States Supreme Court. If the court had had the courage to weigh in either the Wisconsin case or the North Carolina case and say once and for all, partisan gerrymandering, it's rigging these maps, it's rendering voters pretty powerless, we're going to put a stop to it, then we would have seen a very different attitude from our state legislature. They would have recognized the jig's up here. We're not going to get away with this anymore. The court is willing to step in and, say these maps have been rigged, we're throwing them out. That isn't what the court did. So, the General Assembly here in Indiana and many other states says, we've got a good thing going here. They're not going to make a stop. Why should we? I think you would have seen things differently if we had a more evenly divided General Assembly. But we've been working for most of this decade with super majorities of one party. And, super majorities don't listen to the minority. So that's been a big problem. Unfortunately, here in Indiana, unlike states like Michigan, we don't have ballot initiatives. States are showing that citizens have figured this out. They now understand how toxic gerrymandering is. So in states where voters can, take the issue into their hands, they've been very successful at passing ballot initiatives. Unfortunately, in Indiana, the only path to reform goes through the General Assembly, and we've been pretty much blocked. But that doesn't mean that citizens won't be able to impact the process, because quite frankly, we always recognize the enormity of the task that we had at the State House. We always recognize that the General Assembly wasn't going to be likely to pass redistricting reform. So we have come up with a plan B. Now, COVID-19, though, is impacting this just like it's impacting everything. So let's talk a little bit about how the pandemic is going to impact redistricting next year. Well, the census is behind schedule. They have already told Congress, you know what, those deadlines that we're usually able to meet, we're not going to be able to meet them. And so what they're telling Congress is that they won't have the data that states need to draw new maps until next summer. So this is going to be a problem for Indiana because, we have these really short legislative sessions. Next year, we have what we call a long session, but it's still only 60 days long. And by statute, it has to end on April 29th. So that's a problem. If you have to end your session by April 29th and you won't have data to do redistricting until the summer, what are you going to do? Well, there are several different options for Indiana. Some of them good, some of them not so good, some of them better. What they could do, but what I think they're really unlikely to do, because this really doesn't benefit anybody, is use estimated data. Just kind of guess at the numbers and then come back and refine things when they actually have the numbers. But, who does that benefit? You kind of have to do it twice. You could be way off. It's an option, but I don't think it's a good option for anybody. So I don't think it's likely. Another option, we have currently in Indiana law a backup commission. It came into play in 2001, but it's not likely to come into play under regular circumstances when you have one party controlling everything. But the backup commission only applies to congressional districts. And the way it works is if the state legislature cannot agree, if the House and Senate cannot agree on a set of congressional maps, and they adjourn the General Assembly without doing that, then the backup commission comes into play. The backup commission is 5 members, 1 representative of each legislative chamber. So the House Democrats, House Republicans have 2, Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats, that's 4. And then the governor gets the 5th appointment, and that person is the chair. So what the General Assembly could do is amend that statute so that they are responsible for not just the congressional districts, but also the state legislative districts. That would obviously mean that the governor would have much more influence on redistricting under that scenario than he would under a regular scenario where the General Assembly are the ones who are in charge. So that's the backup commission scenario. The third scenario is that they would just have to call a special session and come back at some point in the summer. Now that at some point is kind of tricky because, people need to know what the districts are going to be because they need to plan to run in the district. So, you can't push this back too late because then you start messing with, people's filing deadlines. So we personally think that a special session would be the best scenario. In fact, one of our points for reform had been that if we're going to continue to have the legislature be in charge of this, then why don't we do it in a special session? Because you know, it's very distracting to have a budget and all the different legislative issues that go on during session. Isn't redistricting important enough that we should, you know, have it as the sole focus of a special legislative session? Now, unfortunately, many of our legislators, particularly the Republican leadership, they just don't like the idea of a special session for whatever reason. You know, it seems to signal to voters, we didn't get our work done, we somehow messed up, and so we had to come back. You know, special sessions do cost tax money. So I think there's just this general reluctance among the legislature to call a special session for any reason. But that's one of our things we're working on right now, is to get the leadership to, you know, tell us now. We know that the census data is going to be late. We know it's really unlikely you're going to be able to do this before April 29th. So tell us what you're going to do so that the citizens can get ready. And that is particularly important for us as advocates, because we're going to be running our own process. You know, the General Assembly, they didn't get the message, they didn't listen to us. We didn't get redistricting reform through that process. So we are going to have to create our own process and show them how it's done. So we will create our own Citizens Redistricting Commission. That's one of the big things I'm working on right now, is getting all of the rules and the application process ready. But we're going to model this on the bill that we introduced with Senator John Ruckelshaus. So this will be open to any Hoosier who is interested, would like to devote the time and attention to it. Now, there are some people who wouldn't be qualified. For example, I'm a lobbyist. I'm not qualified to be on the Redistricting Commission. If you're an elected official, you wouldn't be allowed to be on the Redistricting Commission. If you are the officer of a political party, you wouldn't be qualified to be on the commission. But this is open to anybody and everybody across the state, and we need to build a group of some of the brightest, most creative, most active people in our state. It'll be a 9-member commission made up of 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and 3 people who are neither Republican nor Democrat. We need to have diversity in terms of ethnicity, in terms of geography, in terms of gender, in terms of political ideology. The idea is to get a group of Hoosiers together who are representative of Indiana voters and have them be the entity that sits in judgment of what's a good set of maps and what's a partisan gerrymander. So that's the first part of the equation, is getting this group of esteemed, credible Hoosiers that is balanced from all perspectives to be the group that leads a statewide public discussion on redistricting next year. This group will be charged with holding meetings around the state. We hope eventually we'll be able to do a good old-fashioned town hall meeting, but maybe we won't. Maybe we'll be doing Zoom meetings like this, or, you know, communicating virtually, but that'll be the job of the Citizens Redistricting Commission, to educate people and rally people around this point in 2021, where we're having this discussion about congressional and state legislative districts. What do they need to look at like? What type of criteria should they reflect? The second part of the equation is a public mapping project. We're going to build a website. We tried to get the General Assembly to do this year. They didn't take us up on it. So again, we'll do it ourselves. We'll probably be working with a university. I've talked to both Tufts University and Princeton. They both run really impressive public mapping projects. But this will be a website that is loaded with mapping software, as well as census data, demographic data, political data, everything that you need to put together new maps. We'll sponsor a competition. We'll put up a cash prize for the person who delivers what we think is the best public mapping, our best public maps for Congress and state legislature. Again, the Citizens Redistricting Commission will be the judge of the competition. So they'll pick the maps for Congress and state legislature that they think would be best for voters, would end up with more competition in our state's election, would better represent the various communities of interest that exist around our state. So once that is done, once the competition is ended, those best maps are chosen, then we will forward those on to the General Assembly and say, you know, forget about these maps that are being drawn by one party behind closed doors. These maps that were drawn by citizens through a public mapping project, these are the maps that you should adopt and vote on. So, you know, this is only going to work, though, if we have engaged citizens like you watchdog in this process from start to finish. In addition to, you know, generating more maps, I think one of the problems that we have, particularly when you've got one party control, is there's only one map put on the table. We need many different maps. We need, you know, many different options to choose from, and we need careful analysis of what the legislature is proposing. So what we'll be able to do, in addition to generating a lot of different maps, is we'll really be able to dig deep into what the legislature is proposing and dig into those maps and be able to predict, well, what would elections be like under these new districts? How would communities of interest, like minority neighborhoods in Indianapolis, how would they fare under these new maps? So I think we'll have a lot more information getting out to people as to what the impact of the legislative proposals are. You know, I think we have a lot going for us this time around. As somebody who has been through 2 rounds of redistricting previously, going into this 3rd one, I can tell you that Hoosiers are much more aware this time around. So we're really going to have to use both the traditional media and social media to get the word out to our fellow citizens, and really have a conversation next year about, are these maps in the partisan interest or are they in the public interest? So, you know, what can you do there in Montgomery County, there in Crawfordsville to get this, to help with this? Please sign up for our action alerts at commoncause.org. If you're not on our special coalition redistricting listserv, you need to be. So you can get on, just email me at jvaughn@commoncause.org. We'll get you signed up. You know, write a letter to the editor about this issue. You know, the census is extremely topical right now. So you could write a letter to the editor about the census and then talk about how that is going to reach into next year with redistricting reform. Talk radio is really an important way to get our message out. Social media, please, you know, share information about this on Facebook, on Twitter. I don't know if you all had the opportunity to participate a couple of weeks ago in our virtual screening of Uncivil War, which is a new documentary that actually has a segment about our redistricting coalition here in Indiana and our fight here. So it's very timely, very topical, truly in our backyard. So that's available for a virtual screening, a really good way for you to continue the conversation there locally. Please communicate with Representative Tim Brown and Senator Phil Boots. We have what's called the End Gerrymandering Pledge. It's a joint project. Both the League of Women Voters and Common Cause nationally work together on this. It's at endgerrymanderingpledge.org. Many Republicans have signed that pledge. Unfortunately, neither Representative Brown nor Senator Boots have been among those Republicans. So please communicate with them. All we're asking is that they support a process next year that is transparent, that is non-discriminatory and that does not benefit one political party over the other. So they should be able to sign that pledge. Please communicate with them. When we get this public mapping website up next year, I hope you will try your hand at drawing maps. You know, get together with your local league there and work on drawing a map. That will be incredibly important. And then finally, I hope that you'll consider perhaps applying for a seat on the Redistricting Commission if you're one of the folks who is eligible. If you yourself think that's something that you don't want to take on, then I'm sure you know somebody or maybe several people who would be good candidates. So again, a lot of these projects really depend on vigorous citizen participation. And so you guys have really been helpful. You've been leading this effort in your community. I really appreciate everything that you've done so far. I wish that we could rest on our laurels and say, oh, you know, we've done good work. We're going to take some time off. We can't do that. Next year is going to be make it or break it for redistricting in Indiana. I think we've got the tools to end up in a place which is much better than the place we ended up in 10 years ago. But again, the only way it's going to happen is through a lot of people being very active and making their voices heard. So I really appreciate the opportunity to give you an update this morning, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Julia. That was wonderfully informative and will be seen by lots and lots and lots of people, and also inspiring. I would love to feel that inspiration. Let me turn it over now to David and Jennifer for questions you might have.
I've had this question forever, so I'm happy to be here today to get this answered, I'm hoping. I sat in on this process 10 years ago and watched Karen present it to our council with really not much information and not really understanding. All I know is that when I looked at it thinking, why does it have to be such a jigsaw puzzle looking map for our county and our city to try to understand where they're supposed to, who is their representative, one, and two, about voting. Now the voting has been made easier, but I talk to citizens, they just don't get it. And I need to find a way to connect to them and explain without sounding one way or the other, biased one way or the other, about it's just about them. It's about you having the right to vote easily without any confusion. I get calls from every other council person's district or ward, and it's not even my people. And I'm not going to tell them, oh, you just called the wrong council person. I'm going to help them and then connect them with their person. But at the same time, I think they should have an easy site to go to and say, you know, here's my address, here's where I'm supposed to be. And I know there's some out there, but on our county site, there is not. It is so confusing. Even the maps that I went and had them printed off so I could go out and campaign. They had to hand draw in some places that were wrong on the maps that they have on file. So my question is, one, how can I make this relatable to the citizens so that they understand and they want to have that discussion without getting in over their heads? And two, how do we have the county at the local level where people feel comfortable going on, look at their property records? Why can't they have that ability?
Yeah, those are two great questions. In terms of, you know, I would encourage you next year, actually to be a year after when local governments have to redraw their maps, I would encourage you to have your local community do it like a citizens commission. You know, there's nothing that says that you can't replicate, you know, a citizens commission at the local level. And in fact, we are going to be going back to those local communities that passed resolutions calling for the state to do it, to say, hey, you supported this at the local level. Why don't you practice what you preach and put together a group of citizens? And I think that would lead to the first question. How do I get people to understand that this process, which happens once a decade, absolutely impacts their ability to, make their voice heard through voting for a decade. I think if you made it a community-wide activity that, people would, that light bulb would start to go off. I think anytime you try to engage citizens in something, then suddenly it becomes more meaningful. And I think when you try to talk about communities of interest, I mean, Crawfordsville is a small town, but still, I'm sure you have several different communities of interest. And so if you started, just having grassroots conversations about people, how would it make sense to divide our community up in terms of, political districts? What do you think? I'm pretty sure that, when you had this conversation back last decade, it was a handful of people inside the city hall or the county courthouse who had the conversation. And so it's really no surprise that people don't make the connection because, they've not been included. I mean, for many of us back in 2011, we didn't realize that redistricting took place until we went to vote in 2012. And all of a sudden, you didn't know any of the names on the ballot. You hadn't moved, but the lines had moved. And so I would just, suggest that you try to emulate the best practices there locally. And that's also a great way to send a message to your state legislature that, you're supposed to be the leaders in our state, but yet we have local governments really leading on redistricting because we're doing it the way the citizens want it done. And I would just say that the phrase that I have come to understand is the best way to explain this to people is that gerrymandering allows politicians to choose their voters rather than having voters given the ability to choose their elected officials via elections. So just focusing in on how much of a conflict of interest it is to allow the people who will run in the districts to draw the districts.
Mhm.
Hopefully that.
Jennifer and Julia, just a point of information for at least 3 redistrictings in Montgomery County and Crawfordsville, the League of Women Voters really drew the lines.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And it was to the county commissioners or whoever it is that approves them. David and Prue Phillips, who were members of the league, sat down with maps and drew them, and they did it without partisan bias or anything. They just wanted to make districts that made sense and that were equal in population. So just for your information. I guess a question I have for you, Julia, is your preference for a special session, given the circumstances in 2021, your preference for the special session over the commission, the backup. Doesn't that give a huge advantage, even a larger advantage, to the party in control because of their huge majorities in both chambers and control of the governor's office than would the backup commission? And wouldn't the backup commission, in fact, probably be more transparent because you would see who was involved and when they were working on this. They'd have to do it in public, I assume. So just wondering if it wouldn't make more sense to go with this 5-member backup commission.
It's a close call, David. It's definitely, I could see the merits. I mean, the problem with the 5-member backup commission is it really depends on the members, and it really depends on that 5th member that the governor appoints. And so that is one of the reasons, in fact, we faced some criticism from some people that we are currently directing advocacy on redistricting towards the governor. And there are some who would argue, well, the governor doesn't have anything to do with it. I argue that, well, he could next year, he could play an inordinate role. So it really depends on the members, and, you know, that's something that we don't have any control over. I guess, you know, we think during a special session, they still have to play by the rules of the legislature. Now, you're right, a backup commission in theory has to operate under the open door law and be transparent, but I've seen it not always operate that way. There can be a lot of behind closed doors stuff, but that's certainly true of the legislature as well. So I think it depends a lot on the individuals involved. You know, as we keep talking about this, it looks like that might be the preference of the legislature, just given their general blanket opposition to special sessions. So we've got to see, but my point is we need to know. We need to be given some direction from legislative leaders, from the governor, which process we're going to be taking next year. They at least deserve, citizens at least deserve that kind of heads up.
In that special session, would this delay an election?
No, that's the problem. You know, you got to get it in so that people can know what districts they're going to be running in. So yeah, it's a quandary. And you know, a special session doesn't have to go on for weeks. You know, you could do a lot of the committee work outside, then just bring everybody back. You could do this in a week easily, under current House and Senate rules. So, you know, we're not talking about another 30-day session. But yeah, you got to find that sweet spot where pushing this back doesn't push everything else back.
Julia, could you talk about the criteria that you would like to see used in to guide and shape new districts?
Yeah, you can really find much of that in Senator Walker's bill from 2018 and 2019. His bill talked about, you know, things like compactness, geographic compactness, not considering where the incumbent lives. One of the ways we've always drawn maps for the Indiana Senate is to plot the incumbent's address first and then draw the district around them. But, you know, good redistricting practices says that you would draw maps incumbent blind, that you wouldn't know where the incumbent is living. And, you know, if they end up outside their district or in the district with somebody else, then oh well, you know, that'll work itself out, but you don't draw maps around current elected officials. The one criteria that Senator Walker did not include in his bill that we think is important is competition. If you can draw a district to be competitive, that's good for voters, and you know, you should. But another thing that wasn't in Senator Walker's bill is ranking criteria, and that's absolutely critical, because it is impossible to draw a map that is all of these things equally, right? A district that is compact, doesn't bother wondering where the incumbent lives, that is competitive, that protects communities of interest. You know, it's really difficult to get a district that encompasses all of those things equally. So you got to rank criteria. We already know, because of federal court cases, that the top two have to be equal population. That's why we're doing this in the first place. So that's always going to be the top criteria. Second criteria has to be respect for the Voting Rights Act, because unfortunately, redistricting for many years was used to squelch the political power of racial minorities in our country. That's one issue that the Supreme Court wasn't afraid to take on. You know, we have had maps thrown out because of racial gerrymanders for many years. So that's always going to be your second criteria. But then after that, you know, we need to decide, is compactness of higher value than competition? Because sometimes those two things can work against each other. Unfortunately, in Indiana, the current criteria that we have are equal population, respect for the Voting Rights Act, and contiguity. In Indiana, your district has to be connected at all points. You know, you can have a district that starts in Montgomery County, skips over Hendricks County, and then takes up again in Marion County. You know, that would fail the contiguity test. So unfortunately, those are the only three criteria that Indiana legislature will have to follow next year. We'd like to see them have a bit more detailed roadmap.
So any thought ever given to larger multi-member districts and something like proportional voting, where you have 3 members selected from a larger district, and then if the vote is 2/3 Republican and 1/3 Democrat, 2 of the seats go to Republican, 1 goes to a Democrat, and I think that would increase the or reduce the likelihood that you get these huge majorities when you use very small districts and relatively little constraints on how they're drawn.
I agree. Unfortunately, there's really been no conversation inside the State House about proportional representation. Now, you know, David, you've been around a long time, as have I, and you remember probably that we did have multi-member districts back in Indiana many years ago. There was a court case filed, I believe it was in the 80s, mid-80s, and they were outlawed because they were found to be racial gerrymanders. I know in, there was Fort Wayne, Evansville, and Indianapolis. And then there was also that weird 2-member district up in Marion, Grant County. But yeah, that, and that certainly wasn't really what we're talking about here, proportional representation, but that's kind of, I think, what people may remember when they think of multi-member districts here in Indiana.
Yeah, those multi-member districts, the outcome was determined by which candidates got the most votes.
Right.
And people would
Sheer majority vote. Right.
You had 11 Republicans elected from Marion County and 5 Democrats in Lake County. So it wasn't proportional at all.
Exactly. Exactly.
The teacher, you mentioned the teachers being engaged now. Do you think they'll continue to be engaged in when it comes time for this redistricting process? Do they understand how important the issue is to public education in Indiana?
I think they do. You know, we made a point of being out at the big Go Red for Ed rally on Organization Day last November with our petitions, and it was not a tough sell. You know, we would say gerrymandering to a teacher and they would grab our clipboard and, yeah, I get it. I mean, the way we really hope that educators are involved is by getting their students, their colleagues engaged in the public mapping project. I mean, I think this would be a fantastic way to energize a whole new generation of voters around really fundamental democracy issues. So yeah, we hope we have high school students, college students, you know, civics classes across the state. You know, I could see, one of my dreams is that we'll have university, hello Wabash, of people forming teams, you know, geography students and sociology students and poli-sci students, and, you know, put together a multidisciplinary team at the university. And I think it would be really cool if we could have a little sub-competition among universities in our state. You know, I'm rooting for IU, but I mean, if Purdue, if Wabash, if Valpo, you know, submit your maps and I won't be judged. So you don't have to worry about me rigging it for IU. But, you know, this would just be, I think, a great way to teach students about something that is really fundamentally important in our state, and probably get much better, more representative maps than, you know, the legislature is going to give us. So yeah, I think educators have been pushed up against the wall. They get it, and they understand there's no quick fix, and they absolutely get the connection between fair districts and what the future of schools in Indiana are going to be.
Do you have the route for which you would nominate someone you think would be good for this mapping?
We're going to, it'll be on our website, the coalition website, which is All In for Democracy. We'll have rules up, and, you know, people will be able to apply themselves, or, you know, if somebody feels like, I can't do it, but my neighbor would be awesome, then, you know, you can encourage them, or you could nominate them, and then we'd send them out a feeler saying, you know, Jennifer says you would really be great at this. Is this something you might be interested in?
Okay. Julia, how receptive are various media outlets to publicizing the Shadow Redistricting Commission, do you think?
I think they're extremely, and one of the things we might do is have a media partner. You know, one of the groups that has done this in another state, over in Ohio, they partnered with the daily newspaper, the Columbus News Dispatch, and really got a lot of great, you know, free publicity because they were really pushing this. You know, I've been very pleased with the news media here in Indiana. I only wish we had more of it. But they have really been good. And frankly, back in 2011, the Indianapolis Star organized a consortium of, I think it ended up being 17 daily newspapers that were publishing stories about the redistricting process, and, you know, sharing stories amongst the various newspapers. So I thought they did a good job in 2011 trying to educate us about what was going on, and I'm confident they will do a good job in 2021, letting their readers and other, you know, public know about this parallel process that we're creating.
Have we considered a podcast that we could use to just have an expert speaker explaining this to the common citizen that, you know, might not quite understand how it impacts their children at school, their city, their community, their voting.
Yeah, we are exploring any and every way we can to educate the public about this, and I think that that's exactly what you've hit on. You know, we have to tie this issue to other issues. Mm-hmm. You know, frankly, redistricting is wonky. It's a behind the scene issue that most people, until you tie it to something that is very real to them, like their kids' education, like their access to health insurance, like, you know, the cost of their utility bills, then they get it. And so, yeah, that's the way we have to talk about this issue, is its connection to those issues that really impact you. Unfortunately, while all Hoosiers are impacted by redistricting, too many of us think that if I'm not a politician, then, you know, it doesn't impact me.
Right.
Absolutely, right. It does, in kind of a second-hand way, but it absolutely does impact you.
Exactly.
Julie, I think that the issue of competition is one that can be communicated to the citizens. I've studied House elections in Indiana for over the past 50 or 60 years, probably more than that. And you noted that in 2018, 40% of the House districts were uncontested. That figure has gone as high as 50%, going back to 2000. And before 1990, the number of districts uncontested by one of the major parties was down around 5%, and that would go, that very high level of competition would stretch back through all of Indiana House elections. So things have really changed in the last 30 years, and that can be documented and shown pretty easily, I think.
I agree, and I think that the corresponding voter turnout, as competition has declined, as has voter turnout, the two are absolutely tied together. And I think Republicans do have a natural advantage in Indiana. I'm a native Hoosier, grown up, born and bred in this state, but it is not 70 to 80%. I think 55% is a much more realistic figure, and I think that's what I would expect from fairly drawn maps. But we aren't going to get those from Republicans, and we're not going to get those from Democrats. We're going to have to get that from a group of citizens. I am confident we can convene 9 people who can agree that fair maps are far more important than our political ideology. The legislature has told us that those people don't exist. Everybody has their bias, and they are incapable of overcoming that political bias for the greater good. You and I know that there are many, many Hoosiers who would be capable of doing that job. So we're just going to be dependent on folks like you and helping us find people. Now, this is going to be a job. Now, this isn't going to be a walk in the park. We want people who are going to work. We're going to pay you. You're not going to get rich being a member of the Citizens Redistricting Commission, but we recognize this is a job, and we want people to work hard and put a lot of time and effort and thought into it. But we are determined. We are going to find those 9 people who can lead this process next year and help us convince the General Assembly that doing this fairly and transparently and without bias is the best thing for not only Hoosiers, but for these institutions like Congress, like the General Assembly, that we care so much about.
So what's the timeline for selecting the commission?
Well, we hope to late this summer, early fall, get the website up and start pushing the information out. And we hope we are inundated. We hope we are like those poor county clerks who were trying to process all these absentee ballot applications for the June election. We hope we'll be digging out of those all fall, and shortly after the election be able to announce who the members are. We'll pretty quickly start convening meetings around the state. We want to encourage a conversation first about communities of interest, because there are a lot of different communities of interest out around our state, but we need to plot those on the map so that we can recognize them once we start, drawing maps. So, we want to talk about Amish communities up in Northeast Indiana. We want to talk about historic neighborhoods in Evansville. And, we're going to need the public drawing the commissioner's attention to what these communities of interest are. So we're going to start those conversations late this year. Hopefully have the public mapping website up. We'll also start doing trainings on that. Obviously, we won't have census data until some point next year, but we can start training people on how to use the software, you know, what are the various ways you would apply the different criteria, get people comfortable with the technology so that once we have all of the tools available to draw out maps, people will be ready and willing to dive right in.
Excellent, everyone. Do we have other questions?
I don't.
Okay, thank you, David. Jennifer? Marco? Anything?
I think you covered quite a bit of ground here. It's all good stuff.
It is. There's a great amount to distill, and I'm glad, Julia, in the last few minutes, you actually used the term fair maps, which is the big National League term that covers this same big umbrella project. And I can't thank you enough for setting out this map for us in terms of things we can do to give us the information about contacting our representatives who have not yet signed this compact. I want to thank you, especially David, for the League deep history that I was not aware of about David and Prue Phillips drawing our city maps, and that so League of Women Voters did that. That's an honorable thing that we should make known in our community, I think, too, as we go forward. But thank you so much, and thank you for all these connections that you brought us this morning. Clearly within League, we magnify this need for honest and fair redistricting as well, but this idea of coalitions is so important, as Julia said this morning, and I think all of us want to think more about how organizations that we may belong to, beyond the two that we've been mentioning this morning, might want to add into this appeal. So we're so grateful to Common Cause for your in-depth work in this area. So thank you all so much, guests, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thanks, Julia. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
See you soon.
Thank you, Julia.